The small town of Maplewood was quiet that morning, its streets lined with autumn leaves painted in shades of orange and red. The sky above was heavy with gray clouds, as if nature itself mourned the loss of Eleanor Carter. Her funeral brought together a crowd of people who had known her in different ways. Neighbors, friends, former colleagues, and family members all gathered to say their final goodbyes. The church where the service was held stood at the edge of town, an old brick building surrounded by towering oak trees. Inside, rows of wooden pews filled quickly, each seat occupied by someone touched by Eleanor's kindness during her lifetime. 12-year-old Lily sat near the front, her legs dangling off the edge of the pew because they weren't long enough to reach the floor. She wore a black dress borrowed from her mother, which felt too big for her small frame. Her hands clutched a folded piece of paper so tightly that her knuckles turned white. No one noticed how nervous she looked. Everyone assumed it was just grief weighing on her young shoulders. But it wasn't sadness alone making her heart race. It was what she carried in her hand. Lily glanced sideways at her father, Mark, sitting stiffly beside her. His face was pale, his jaw clenched as he stared straight ahead without blinking. He hadn't cried since hearing about Eleanor's death, but there was something distant in his eyes, like he was lost in thought. Every now and then, someone would pat him on the shoulder or whisper condolences, but he barely responded. Lily wanted to ask him if he was okay, but she didn't know how to start the conversation, not when her own mind was spinning with secrets. Behind them, other relatives whispered among themselves. Some talked about how sudden Eleanor's passing had been, while others speculated about whether she'd been feeling unwell before she died. It must have been her heart, one cousin murmured. Another shook her head. No, I heard it might have been something else. Maybe medication. The words drifted through the air like smoke, vague yet unsettling. Lily tried not to listen, but bits and pieces stuck in her mind, adding to the storm brewing inside her. As the pastor began speaking, Lily tuned out most of what he said. Instead, her thoughts kept returning to the letter hidden in her hand. She had found it 3 days earlier while helping clean out Eleanor's bedroom. It was tucked deep inside an old Bible on the nightstand, almost as though Eleanor had meant for someone specific to find it someday. When Lily opened it, her breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, like it had been written in a hurry, or maybe under duress. Each word sent chills down her spine. If you're reading this, I'm probably gone. Something isn't right here. Someone is trying to hurt me. She read it over and over again that night, unable to sleep. Who could have done such a thing? And why? The questions haunted her, gnawing at her resolve until she decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. If no one else knew the truth, then it was up to her to share it, even if it meant risking everything. Now, sitting in the church, surrounded by faces both familiar and unfamiliar, Lily felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. Could she really stand up and speak in front of all these people? What would they think of her? Would anyone believe her? The pastor paused, signaling the time for family members to share memories of Eleanor. Mark hesitated, looking uncomfortable, but before he could decide what to do, Lily stood up. All eyes turned to her, curious and expectant. For a moment, she froze, clutching the letter tighter than ever. Then, taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. Lily's discovery of the letter had been accidental, almost like fate had guided her to it. It happened on a rainy afternoon, 3 days before the funeral, when she was helping her dad clean out Eleanor's bedroom. The room smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that always reminded Lily of her grandmother's warm hugs and soft laughter. As she sorted through books on the nightstand, her fingers brushed against something tucked inside an old leather-bound Bible. Curious, she opened it and found the folded piece of paper nestled between the pages. At first glance, the letter seemed ordinary, but as soon as Lily unfolded it and began reading, her heart sank. The handwriting was shaky, unlike her grandmother's usual neat script, and the words were hurried, almost frantic. If you're reading this, it began, then I'm no longer here. Something terrible is happening to me, and I don't know who to trust. Her eyes widened as she read further. Eleanor wrote about feeling watched, about strange things happening in her home. Medicine bottles disappearing, doors left unlocked at night, and unexplained noises that made her feel unsafe. The letter didn't name anyone directly, but it hinted at betrayal from someone close to her. "It's someone in our family," Eleanor had written. "They'd been trying to make me sick, tampering with my pills. I tried to tell others, but they dismissed me as paranoid. Please, if you find this, help me uncover the truth." The final line struck Lily the hardest. "I don't think I'll live much longer." Her hands trembled as she finished reading. She felt a mix of fear, anger, and confusion swirling inside her chest. How could this have happened? Why hadn't anyone noticed? The thought of her kind, loving grandmother suffering alone, and possibly dying because of someone's cruel actions, made tears well up in Lily's eyes. She wanted to scream, to run downstairs and show the letter to her dad right away. But something stopped her. What if he didn't believe her? Or worse, what if the person responsible was closer than she realized? For hours, Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the letter as raindrops streaked down the windowpane. She tried to think rationally, replaying conversations she'd overheard recently. There had been arguments between Eleanor and Uncle Greg about money, though Lily hadn't paid much attention at the time. And then there was Aunt Susan, who often complained bitterly about how Eleanor spent her savings. Could one of them be involved? Or was it someone else entirely? By the time Mark called her downstairs for dinner, Lily had tucked the letter into her pocket, determined to keep it safe. That night, lying awake in bed, she wrestled with what to do. Should she speak up now, while people were still grieving, or wait until after the funeral? Every option felt risky. If she stayed silent, the truth might never come out. But if she spoke too soon, would anyone listen? People tended to dismiss kids, especially when emotions ran high. The next day, as preparations for the funeral continued, Lily carried the letter everywhere she went, folding and unfolding it countless times. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was her responsibility to act, that Eleanor had trusted her, even without knowing it, to bring the truth to light. Yet the weight of that responsibility terrified her. What if she ruined the family forever? What if she got hurt for speaking out? As the day of the funeral approached, Lily's resolve hardened. She knew she couldn't let fear stop her. Her grandmother deserved justice, and if no one else was willing to fight for it, then she would. Sitting in church that morning, surrounded by relatives and friends, Lily clutched the letter tightly, rehearsing what she would say under her breath. She didn't care if people judged her or laughed at her. All that mattered was honoring Eleanor's memory and exposing the shocking truth hidden within those fragile sheets of paper. When the pastor paused to invite family members to share memories of Eleanor, a heavy silence fell over the church. Mark hesitated, glancing around as if hoping someone else would step forward. He opened his mouth to decline but froze when he felt a small tug on his sleeve. Turning his head, he saw Lily standing beside him, her face pale but determined. For a moment, he thought about pulling her back down, worried she might feel overwhelmed speaking in front of so many people. But something in her eyes stopped him, a quiet strength that reminded him so much of Eleanor. With a deep breath, Lily stepped into the aisle, clutching the folded letter tightly in one hand. The shuffle of feet and murmurs faded as everyone turned their attention to her. Some smiled encouragingly, thinking she was about to share a sweet story or memory. Others exchanged puzzled looks, surprised to see such a young girl take center stage. As Lily walked slowly toward the podium, her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the entire room could hear it. She gripped the edges of the wooden stand for support, trying to steady herself before beginning. Instead of launching into a heartful tribute, Lily unfolded the crumpled letter and held it up for everyone to see. "This isn't a eulogy," she began, her voice trembling but clear enough to carry across the silent room. "This is a letter my grandmother wrote, and I think you all need to hear what she said." A ripple of confusion spread through the congregation. Whispers broke out, some curious, others skeptical. But Lily pressed on, ignoring the murmurs. She read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. "If you're reading this, then I'm no longer here. Something terrible is happening to me, and I don't know who to trust." Gasps echoed through the church as people leaned forward, hanging on every syllable. Lily continued, describing how Eleanor had written about feeling unsafe, about being watched and having her medication tampered with. When she reached the part where Eleanor mentioned betrayal within the family, tension crackled in the air like static electricity. Eyes darted around the room, suspicion settling heavily on different faces. Uncle Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Aunt Susan's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers twisting nervously around her handkerchief. Even Mark looked stunned, his brow furrowing as he processed what his daughter was saying. No one dared interrupt her, though some whispered urgently to their neighbors, trying to make sense of the shocking revelation unfolding before them. As Lily neared the end of the letter, her voice wavered slightly, but she didn't stop. "I don't think I'll live much longer," she read, tears spilling down her cheeks. The finality of those words hung in the air, leaving an eerie stillness behind. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, chaos erupted. People began talking over one another, some accusing Lily of lying or exaggerating, while others demanded answers. One cousin shouted, "Who do you think did this?" pointing accusingly at Greg, whose face flushed red under the scrutiny. Mark stood abruptly, raising his hands to try calming the crowd. "Everyone, please," he called out, his voice strained. But Lily interrupted him, stepping closer to the edge of the podium. Through her tears, she said firmly, "I'm not making this up. Grandma trusted me to find this letter, and I'm not going to let her down." Her words silenced the room once again, the weight of her conviction undeniable. It was then that Mark realized the gravity of the situation. With a shaky hand, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked for police assistance. The moment Mark's call to 911 ended, the atmosphere in the church shifted from chaotic to tense. Officers arrived within minutes, their presence immediately commanding attention. Dressed in uniforms and carrying notepads, they moved through the crowd with calm authority. People whispered nervously as the officers introduced themselves and asked who had made the report. Mark stepped forward reluctantly, his arm protectively around Lily, who clutched the letter like it was a lifeline. One officer knelt to speak directly to Lily, his tone gentle but firm. "Can you tell me what's going on?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers without judgment. Though her hands trembled, Lily nodded and handed over the letter. As the officer read it carefully, his expression grew more serious. He exchanged glances with his partner before turning back to Lily. "You did the right thing by bringing this to us," he said, his voice reassuring. Those words seemed to ease some of the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Meanwhile, other officers began securing the scene. They spoke quietly with Mark, asking permission to search Eleanor's home for evidence. Mark hesitated only briefly before nodding, still struggling to process everything that had unfolded. The thought of his mother being harmed, not by illness, but by someone close to her, left him reeling. His mind raced with questions. Who could have done such a thing? Why hadn't anyone noticed sooner? And how had Lily been brave enough to uncover the truth when everyone else had missed it? Back at Eleanor's house, detectives worked methodically, searching for anything that might corroborate the claims in the letter. They combed through her medicine cabinet first, finding several prescription bottles with labels slightly altered or smudged. A closer inspection revealed traces of unfamiliar substances mixed into the pills, a clear sign of tampering. Next, they examined financial records scattered across Eleanor's desk. Among them was a forged signature approving large transfers to an account linked to none other than Greg, Lily's uncle. Each discovery sent shivers down the spines of those working the case. While the investigation continued, word spread quickly among the family members waiting anxiously outside the house. Whispers turned to heated arguments as accusations flew. Greg became the primary target of suspicion, especially after officers found surveillance footage showing him entering Eleanor's bedroom late at night just days before her passing. When confronted, he initially denied any wrongdoing, claiming he'd only been checking on her. But the mounting evidence painted a damning picture, and cracks began to show in his composure. Lily stayed close to her father throughout the ordeal, leaning against him whenever fear threatened to overwhelm her. Despite the turmoil around her, she felt a strange sense of relief, knowing the truth was finally coming to light. Still, guilt gnawed at her. What if she'd acted sooner? What if finding the letter earlier could have saved her grandmother? Mark noticed her distress and pulled her aside, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "You did everything you could," he told her firmly, cupping her face in his hands. "Grandma would be proud of you." As the hours passed, the tension inside the house reached its peak. Detectives called Greg in for questioning, leaving the rest of the family to wait uneasily. Some paced back and forth, while others sat silently, staring off into space. Aunt Susan sobbed uncontrollably, insisting she'd had no idea what Greg was doing. Others argued bitterly, pointing fingers and dredging up old grievances. Through it all, Lily remained quiet, observing everything with wide, watchful eyes. She knew the hardest part was yet to come, but for now, she allowed herself a small measure of hope. Justice for her grandmother felt closer than ever. The interrogation room at the police station was small and sterile, with fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. Greg sat slumped in a metal chair, his face pale and drawn as Detective Harris leaned across the table, his arms crossed and eyes piercing. The evidence against Greg had been stacking up. Tampered medication bottles, forged signatures on financial documents, and surveillance footage showing him sneaking into Eleanor's bedroom late at night. At first, Greg had tried to deny everything, insisting he'd only gone to check on his mother because she wasn't answering her phone. But as the detective laid out each piece of evidence one by one, his defenses began to crumble. "You want to tell me again why your fingerprints are all over these altered prescriptions?" Detective Harris asked, sliding photos of the pill bottles across the table. Greg stared at them, his jaw tightening as sweat beaded on his forehead. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. The weight of the evidence pressed down on him like a physical force, making it harder for him to keep up the charade. Finally, after hours of relentless questioning, Greg broke. His shoulders sagged, and tears welled up in his eyes as he confessed. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered hoarsely, burying his face in his hands. I needed money. I lost my job. I had debts piling up, and Mom always talked about leaving everything to charity when she died. I thought if I could make her sick enough, just weak enough, I could get power of attorney and take control of her accounts." He paused, choking back sobs. "But I swear, I never wanted her to die." Detective Harris exchanged a glance with his partner before jotting down notes. While Greg's confession confirmed much of what Lily had uncovered, it also left the family grappling with conflicting emotions. Was Greg truly remorseful, or was he simply trying to save himself? Mark wrestled with anger and disbelief as he listened to the recorded statement later that evening. How could someone so close to Eleanor betray her trust like that? And how had no one noticed the signs until now? For Lily, hearing Greg's confession brought a mix of relief and sadness. Relief because the truth was finally out, and sadness because it painted a painful picture of greed and desperation within their own family. She replayed the events leading up to Eleanor's death in her mind, the arguments, the strange disappearances of medicine bottles, the feeling that something wasn't quite right, and realized how many red flags she'd missed. It made her feel guilty, even though there was nothing more she could have done at the time. As news of Greg's arrest spread, the family fractured further. Some relatives rallied around Mark and Lily, furious at Greg's betrayal and determined to support them through the aftermath. Others distanced themselves, embarrassed or unwilling to confront the ugliness that had surfaced. Aunt Susan, who had initially defended Greg, eventually broke down completely, admitting she'd suspected something was wrong, but hadn't dared to speak up. "I should have said something," she admitted tearfully to Mark. "I'm so sorry." In the days that followed, Eleanor's will became another point of contention. Thanks to the investigation, detectives discovered an earlier draft of the document tucked away in a safety deposit box, untouched and unaltered. This version clearly outlined Eleanor's wishes, ensuring her estate would go to those she truly cared about rather than being funneled into Greg's hands. Though it couldn't undo the pain caused by his actions, it provided some measure of closure for the family. Through it all, Lily remained a quiet anchor for her father. She attended meetings with lawyers and detectives alongside him, offering steady support despite her own lingering fears. Slowly but surely, they began piecing their lives back together, not forgetting what had happened, but learning to move forward with the truth guiding them. For the first time since finding the letter, Lily allowed herself to imagine a future where Eleanor's memory could shine brightly once more, untainted by betrayal. The days following Greg's confession were a whirlwind of emotions for the Carter family. News of his arrest spread quickly through Maplewood, turning the small town into a hive of whispers and speculation. Neighbors who had once greeted Greg warmly now avoided eye contact, their faces etched with pity or disdain. For Mark and Lily, the hardest part wasn't the stares or gossip. It was facing the shattered pieces of their family. Every interaction felt strained, every conversation laced with unspoken questions. How could this happen? Why didn't we see it sooner? Can we ever trust each other again? Mark tried to hold things together, but the weight of everything pressed heavily on him. He spent long hours sitting in Eleanor's empty house, staring at her favorite armchair, as if hoping she'd walk in and make everything right again. Memories flooded back. The sound of her laughter, the way she always knew how to calm him when life felt overwhelming. But those memories were now tinged with sadness, knowing she had spent her final days feeling unsafe and betrayed by someone she loved. Lily, too, struggled to process everything. At school, kids whispered behind her back, some calling her brave, others accusing her of ruining her family. She kept quiet most of the time, refusing to rise to their taunts or defend herself. Instead, she channeled her energy into helping her dad heal. On weekends, they cleaned out Eleanor's house together, sorting through decades of belongings. Each item told a story: a faded photo album, a stack of handwritten recipes, a quilt stitched with love. As they worked side by side, father and daughter began to reconnect, finding solace in shared grief. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mark finally broke the silence. "You know," he said softly, "Mom, we've been so proud of you." Lily looked up, surprised. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark smiled faintly. "Because you did what no one else could. You stood up for her when she couldn't stand up for herself. That takes real courage." His words brought tears to Lily's eyes, but they also gave her strength. For weeks, she carried the guilt of not acting sooner, wondering if she could have saved Eleanor. Hearing her dad acknowledge her bravery helped lighten that burden, even if only a little. It reminded her that while she couldn't change the past, she could honor her grandmother's memory by moving forward with hope and resilience. As the weeks turned into months, the family began taking steps toward healing. Mark enrolled himself and Lily in therapy sessions, where they learned to navigate their complicated feelings about Eleanor's death and Greg's betrayal. At first, it was hard. Talking openly about pain and anger left both of them emotionally drained. But over time, they found comfort in sharing their thoughts and fears with someone who understood. Therapy became a safe space where they could grieve without judgment and rebuild their bond. Meanwhile, legal proceedings against Greg moved steadily forward. Though he pleaded guilty to tampering with Eleanor's medication, his lawyers argued that he hadn't intended to cause her death. The judge sentenced him to several years in prison, along with mandatory counseling for financial mismanagement and ethical decision-making. While justice was served, it offered little comfort to the Carters. Knowing Greg was behind bars didn't bring Eleanor back, nor did it erase the scars left behind. Despite the lingering pain, moments of joy began to creep back into their lives. Mark started volunteering at a local community center, teaching woodworking classes to kids. Watching them create something from nothing reminded him of happier times with Eleanor. Lily threw herself into school projects, earning praise from teachers for her creativity and determination. Slowly but surely, they discovered that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding new ways to carry the past with them as they built a future. By spring, the trees around Maplewood bloomed with fresh leaves, symbolizing renewal and growth. One afternoon, as Lily planted flowers in Eleanor's garden, a project she and her dad had decided to tackle together, she paused and looked up at the sky. "Do you think Grandma's happy now?" she asked quietly. Mark knelt beside her, brushing dirt off his hands. "Yeah," he replied with a gentle smile. "I think she's watching over us, proud of how far we've come." And for the first time in months, Lily believed him. By the time summer rolled around, life in Maplewood had begun to settle into a fragile kind of normalcy. The shock of Eleanor's death and Greg's betrayal still lingered, but the sharp edges of grief were slowly softening. For Mark and Lily, healing wasn't linear. It came in waves, some days brighter than others. They learned to navigate their new reality together, leaning on each other when the weight of everything felt too heavy to bear alone. One of the biggest changes was how they spent their time. Mark threw himself into fixing up Eleanor's old house, transforming it into a cozy home for him and Lily. Every weekend, they worked side by side, painting walls, sanding floors, and rearranging furniture. It became more than just a project. It was a way for them to honor Eleanor's memory while creating something new. On lazy afternoons, they'd sit on the porch with glasses of lemonade, talking about anything and everything. Sometimes they laughed until their sides hurt. Other times, they sat quietly, letting the comfort of each other's presence speak louder than words. Lily found her own rhythm too. At school, she joined a public speaking club, surprising even herself with how much she enjoyed sharing stories and ideas with others. Her teacher encouraged her to enter an upcoming storytelling competition, and though the thought terrified her at first, she decided to give it a try. She practiced tirelessly, crafting a narrative that wove together her grandmother's kindness, her own fears, and the courage it took to expose the truth. Each rehearsal brought a sense of purpose, as if she were reclaiming her voice after months of feeling silenced by guilt and doubt. The competition arrived on a warm June evening, held in the town hall auditorium. Rows of chairs filled quickly as families and friends gathered to support the young participants. When Lily stepped onto the stage, her heart raced so fast she could barely hear the applause. But as she looked out at the crowd and spotted her dad sitting near the front, beaming with pride, her nerves began to fade. Holding the same crumpled letter that had started it all, she began to speak. "I want to tell you a story about my grandmother," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "She was one of the kindest people I've ever known, a person who always put others first. But there's another part of her story that not many people know. My grandma didn't die peacefully like we thought. Someone close to her betrayed her trust, making her sick on purpose." Gasps rippled through the audience, but Lily pressed on, her tone unwavering. "I found out because she left me a letter, a message asking for help. And even though I was scared, I knew I couldn't stay silent." As she recounted the events leading up to the funeral and the aftermath, the room fell utterly silent. People leaned forward, captivated by her bravery and honesty. By the time she finished, tears glistened in the eyes of nearly everyone present. When the judges announced the winners later that night, Lily didn't win first place. But the standing ovation she received meant far more than any trophy ever could. Afterward, strangers approached her to shake her hand or offer words of encouragement. A few shared their own stories of speaking up against injustice, telling her she inspired them to do the same. For Lily, it was overwhelming yet deeply rewarding. She realized then that her grandmother's legacy wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about using that truth to spark change. Back home, Mark hugged her tightly, his eyes shining with tears. "You did amazing tonight," he whispered. "Mom would have been so proud." That night, as they sat together under a blanket of stars, Lily felt a profound sense of peace. Though the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, she knew they were stronger now, not just as individuals, but as a family. Together, they had faced unimaginable pain and emerged with a renewed sense of hope. And for the first time in a long time, Lily allowed herself to believe that brighter days truly lay ahead. Months after the storytelling competition, Lily stood on a different stage, this time in her middle school auditorium. It was Courage Day, an annual event where students were encouraged to share personal stories or messages that inspired others. As she waited backstage, clutching the same crumpled letter that had changed everything, her hands trembled slightly. But this wasn't the nervous shaking of before. It was excitement mixed with purpose. She knew what she wanted to say, and she knew it mattered. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage to polite applause. The spotlight felt warm on her skin as she adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of curious faces. Some kids whispered to each other, wondering why someone so young would speak at such an event. Others sat quietly, intrigued by the girl who had become something of a local legend over the past year. Taking a deep breath, Lily began. "I'm here today because I want to talk about courage," she said, her voice clear and steady. "A lot of people think courage means being fearless, but that's not true. Courage is doing the right thing even when you're scared. It's speaking up when everyone else stays silent." She paused, unfolding the letter carefully. This letter belonged to my grandmother. Before she died, she wrote it to tell the truth about something terrible happening to her. When I found it, I didn't know what to do. I was scared of ruining my family, scared of being wrong, scared of standing alone. The room grew quieter as Lily continued, but I realized something important. Staying silent wouldn't bring my grandma back, but speaking up might help stop someone else from getting hurt. So I did it. I told everyone what I knew, even though it was hard. And guess what? People listened. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person brave enough to start. Her words resonated deeply with the audience. Teachers nodded approvingly, while students exchanged thoughtful glances. A few wiped away tears, moved by her honesty. Lily went on to explain how uncovering the truth had been painful, not just for her, but for her entire family. Yet, she emphasized that healing came from facing the truth head-on, no matter how difficult it seemed. "We can't change the past," she said, "but we can choose how we move forward. We can choose to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." As she wrapped up her speech, Lily held the letter high for everyone to see. "This piece of paper taught me that our voices matter. Even if we're young, even if we're scared, we have power. Don't let fear stop you from doing the right thing. Be brave for yourself, for your family, and for anyone who needs someone to fight for them." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the auditorium long after she stepped off the stage. Students surrounded her afterward, asking questions and thanking her for sharing her story. Some promised they'd think twice about staying silent when they saw something wrong. Others simply hugged her, overwhelmed by her message of resilience and hope. That evening, as Mark drove her home, he glanced at her proudly. "You've got your grandma's spirit, you know that," he said with a smile. Lily grinned back, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. Over the months, she'd come to understand that Eleanor's legacy wasn't just about justice. It was about inspiring others to be courageous, kind, and unafraid to make a difference. By the end of the school year, Lily's story had reached far beyond Maplewood. Local newspapers featured her in articles about bravery and integrity, and teachers across the district used her speech as an example of leadership. More importantly, she noticed subtle changes around her. Kids standing up for classmates being bullied, friends encouraging each other to speak their minds, and communities coming together to support those in need. For Lily, life wasn't perfect. There were still moments when sadness crept in, reminding her of the grandmother she missed dearly. But she carried Eleanor's memory with her every day, letting it guide her actions and fuel her determination to create positive change. In doing so, she proved that even the smallest voice could spark the biggest transformations, and that courage, no matter how quiet, always leaves a lasting impact.